My mother left for her second shift before I woke up, and my father left 3 years before that and never came back. I was 11 years old, and I'd already learned exactly what silence sounds like in an apartment that's too big for the amount of love left inside it. I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened that October. Loneliness doesn't always look the way people expect. It's not always tears, not always dramatic. Sometimes it's just a boy eating cereal alone at 6 a.m., packing his own lunch because his mother's already gone, walking to school without anyone noticing whether he made it there or not. Nobody at school particularly disliked me. That would have almost been easier, something to point to, something to explain. Instead, I was just invisible. The kid teachers forgot to call on. The kid nobody picked first, and nobody picked last either, because being picked last still means someone's noticing you exist. I'd learned to disappear so completely that even I sometimes forgot I was in the room. That October, though, something happened that I didn't expect. Something that started small, almost nothing at all, a single interaction after school that I nearly walked past without noticing. I didn't know yet that it would become the first thread in something that would eventually pull me out of the quiet I'd built my entire life inside of. I just knew that for the first time in longer than I could remember, someone had actually looked at me like I was really there. Her name was Mrs. Alvarez, and she ran the small library 2 blocks from my school, the kind of place most kids my age had stopped visiting once video games and phones became more interesting than books with cracked spines and yellowed pages. I hadn't gone there on purpose that first day. It had started raining hard enough that walking the rest of the way home seemed unbearable, and the library was the only building with its lights still on and its door unlocked. I slipped inside, dripping, expecting someone to tell me to leave if I wasn't going to actually use the space. Instead, Mrs. Alvarez looked up from behind the front desk, studied me for a moment, and simply said, "There's a towel in the back if you want to dry off. No rush leaving." Nobody had spoken to me like that in longer than I could remember. Not with irritation disguised as kindness, just genuine, uncomplicated kindness. I dried off and sat in the corner, pretending to read a book I wasn't actually absorbing, mostly just enjoying the fact that someone in the room knew I existed. I came back the next day, and the day after that. Mrs. Alvarez never asked too many questions, never pushed, just let me exist in that space quietly, occasionally recommending a book, occasionally asking small, easy questions about my day that didn't require me to explain anything I wasn't ready to explain. What I didn't know then was that Mrs. Alvarez had already noticed things about me that I hadn't said out loud to anyone. The same shoes every day, slightly too small. The way I lingered near closing time, in no hurry to go home to an empty apartment. The quiet, careful way I flinched whenever adults raised their voices, even in normal conversation. She hadn't said anything about any of it yet, but she was paying attention in a way nobody else in my life had bothered to for a very long time. By November, the library had become the only place I actually wanted to be. My mother worked doubles most days, sometimes triples when the diner needed coverage, and by the time she got home, I was usually already asleep, or pretending to be, because the exhaustion in her face made me feel guilty for wanting anything from her at all. Mrs. Alvarez started keeping small things aside for me. Granola bars in a desk drawer, extras she claimed the library always ordered too many of. A worn jacket that someone forgot and was apparently exactly my size. I understood, even at 11, that these weren't accidents. I just didn't understand why she was doing it, or why it made something in my chest ache in a way I didn't have words for yet. One evening, close to closing time, she sat down across from me instead of behind her desk, something she'd never done before. "Can I ask you something? And you don't have to answer if you don't want to," she said. I nodded, cautious. "Is everything okay at home?" I felt my whole body go still, the way it always did whenever adults asked questions that got too close to things I'd learned to keep hidden. "Everything's fine," I said automatically, the answer I'd practiced without realizing I'd practiced it. Mrs. Alvarez didn't push. She just nodded slowly, like she'd expected that answer, and said, "Okay. Just know this library's open every day after school, and I'm always here if that ever changes." I didn't know it then, but that conversation was the first domino in something much bigger, something that would eventually involve a phone call I didn't know she'd made, a visit from someone I didn't expect, and a truth about my home life that I'd been protecting far too carefully for far too long. The truth was simpler than anyone probably expected. and somehow harder to say out loud because of it. My mother wasn't cruel. She wasn't neglectful in the way people picture when they hear stories like this. She was just drowning, working every hour she could find, trying to keep an apartment over our heads after my father left with most of our savings and none of his responsibilities. I'd started covering for her without anyone teaching me to, telling teachers she was just running late when parent conferences went unanswered, making sure the apartment looked clean enough that if anyone ever visited, they wouldn't ask questions, learning to make dinner from whatever was in the fridge, learning which neighbors would let me sit in their apartment quietly if I needed somewhere to be that wasn't empty and silent. I wasn't protecting a secret because I was ashamed of my mother. I was protecting her because some instinct in me understood that if anyone found out how much I was managing on my own, they might decide she couldn't handle things, and I was terrified of what that might mean for both of us. Mrs. Alvarez must have sensed some version of this, even without me saying it directly, because 2 weeks after that conversation, something changed. I arrived at the library one afternoon to find a woman I didn't recognize sitting near the front desk, a laptop open, a folder of papers beside her. Mrs. Alvarez introduced her carefully, gently, as someone who helps families sometimes, when things get a little overwhelming. My stomach dropped immediately. I understood, without being told directly, exactly what kind of visit this was. "I'm not in trouble, am I?" I asked, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. The woman, whose name was Ms. Patterson, shook her head gently. "No, sweetheart. Nobody's in trouble. I just want to understand how things have been at home, so we can figure out how to help." I looked at Mrs. Alvarez, feeling something between betrayal and relief tangled together in my chest, unsure yet which feeling was going to win. Mrs. Alvarez knelt down slightly, meeting my eyes directly. "I called her because I care about you, not because I want to take anything away from you or your mom. Sometimes families just need a little extra support to make things easier. That's all this is." I didn't say anything for a long moment, my mind racing through every possible consequence, every fear I'd been carrying since my father left. Would they take me away? Would my mother get in trouble for working so much? Would this make everything worse instead of better? Miss Patterson asked gentle questions, nothing accusatory, mostly about my daily routine, about meals, about who was around when my mother worked late. I answered carefully at first, then, slowly, more honestly than I'd been with anyone in years, the exhaustion of holding everything together alone finally outweighing my fear of what honesty might cost. By the time my mother arrived that evening, called in advance by Mrs. Alvarez to explain gently what was happening, I expected anger, or panic, or the kind of overwhelmed reaction I'd spent years trying to prevent. Instead, my mother sat down across from Ms. Patterson, and after a long silence, she started crying, quietly, the kind of exhausted tears that come from finally being allowed to stop pretending everything is fine. "I didn't know how to ask for help," she admitted. "I didn't know who to ask, or if anyone would even believe things were as hard as they've been." Ms. Patterson explained programs my mother hadn't known existed. After-school support that would mean I wasn't alone every evening. Resources for reduced work hours without losing income entirely. A community food program that would ease some of the constant, quiet worry about groceries. I sat there, watching my mother finally receive the kind of support she'd needed for years, understanding for the first time that asking for help wasn't the failure I'd always assumed it was. The months that followed weren't a dramatic transformation, not the kind you see in movies where everything suddenly becomes perfect. My mother still worked hard, though her schedule became more manageable with the support Ms. Patterson helped arrange. I still went to the library most afternoons, though now it felt less like escape and more like a place I genuinely wanted to be, surrounded by people who'd become something like a second family. Mrs. Alvarez never made a big deal out of what she'd done. When I finally thanked her properly, months later, she just shrugged and said, "I just paid attention. That's all anyone really needs sometimes, someone willing to actually look." I think about that a lot now, years later. How close I came to spending my entire childhood invisible, quietly managing more than any 11-year-old should have to manage, simply because nobody around me had bothered to really look until Mrs. Alvarez did. My mother and I are closer now than we've ever been, built on an honesty neither of us knew how to offer each other before that October. She still works hard, but she's not drowning anymore, not carrying everything alone the way she was for those first few years after my father left. I volunteer at that same library now, on weekends, helping kids with homework, sometimes just sitting quietly with the ones who remind me of myself at that age, the ones who've learned to disappear so well that most adults walk right past them without noticing. I don't know what would have happened if that rainstorm hadn't pushed me through that library door all those years ago. I don't know if anyone else would have noticed what Mrs. Alvarez noticed, or if I would have kept disappearing quietly for years longer than I actually did. So I'll ask you what I've asked myself since that October. How many kids are sitting in a room right now, quietly invisible, waiting for just one person to actually look? And if you were in a position to be that person, would you take the chance to really see them?